The standing stones at the edge of Aldenmere had not surprised me in 300 years. I knew every crack in their gray faces, every tuft of winter grass that pushed through the frozen ground at their base. I had performed the quarterly ceiling rite alone for so long that my hands moved without instruction. The pressed palm, the spoken word, the low pulse of old power that confirmed the boundary between my kingdom and the world beyond it was holding. The wolves of my court did not even bother to accompany me anymore. They knew I would return alone, as I always did, with nothing to report. That evening the sky above the stones was the color of cold iron. The wind came from the north and smelled of coming snow. I pressed my palm flat against the central stone, said the old words, and felt the familiar answer. A hum, a settling, the boundary knitting itself closed for another season. Then the stones flared white. Not the dull amber of the ceiling. White, the color I had not seen in 300 years, the color the stones showed only when the boundary opened from the other side. I stepped back. My wolf rose in my chest, not with aggression, not with alarm, with something I had no name for, something I had given up expecting. A pull, as though a string I had forgotten existed had been plucked somewhere behind my ribs. The central stone split the air, and a young woman in a traveling cloak stepped through, head down, consulting something in a small worn ledger, and walked directly into my chest. She bounced back. Her satchel hit the ground and burst open, scattering small cloth pouches of dried herbs across the frozen grass. She looked up at me. She had dark eyes and ink on her fingers. She looked at me the way a person looks at an unexpected wall. "You," she said, "are standing exactly where I was trying to walk." I had not been spoken to that way in longer than I could reliably remember. She crouched down and began gathering her pouches, muttering names under her breath: feverwort, pale nettle, dried stonecress, cataloging them as she went, checking each one before it went back into the satchel. She had her priorities, and I was evidently not among them. "Where," I said, "did you come from?" "The road past the mill." She tied the satchel's strap. "Or I was. I've been following a deer trail for about an hour, and I think the trail disagreed with me." She stood. She looked past me at the stones, then at the darkening meadow, then at the faint torchlight of Aldenmere's outer walls in the distance. She looked back at me. "Where am I?" "Aldenmere." She turned the name over the way she had turned over her pouches, checking it. "I don't know that village." "It is not a village." She waited for me to say more. When I did not, she simply accepted this with a small nod, the nod of a person who has encountered gaps in information before and has learned to proceed anyway. "Is there an inn?" I stood in the last light of a winter evening, 300 years old, with the boundary stones still faintly glowing at my back, and my wolf pressing forward in my chest like a man leaning toward something he has not dared to want. And I told a lost herbalist's daughter that Aldenmere did not have an inn, but that there was a fire inside. She said that would do, and followed me in. My court's wolves met us at the gate. There were 14 of them resting in the outer yard when we arrived, great gray and black creatures, the oldest of my pack, who chose their own hours and answered to no one. They did not rise for visitors. They did not rise for my council members, who had grown so accustomed to being ignored that they simply stepped around the wolves as though they were large and inconveniently placed furniture. They rose for her, all 14 at once from a dead sleep. They came to their feet without sound, and then, and I watched this with something I can only describe as stunned silence, they moved toward her, not in a line of threat but in a slow, deliberate circle. They circled her, close enough that their breath was visible in the cold air, tails held low, not tucked in fear but lowered in the way wolves hold themselves when they are in the presence of something they recognize. She stopped walking. She looked at them, not with fear, which I would have understood, and not with the performed bravado some visitors showed, which I always saw through. She looked at them with attention, the kind of attention a person gives to something they genuinely want to understand. The oldest wolf, Brennan, who had not shown interest in anything or anyone in 40 years, walked directly up to her and pressed his head against her open hand. She looked at me. Is this normal? No, I said. She looked back at Brennan. She scratched behind his ear with the matter-of-fact tenderness of someone who has handled animals all her life. He leaned into it. Beside him, two of the younger wolves lay back down, not retreating, settling, the way wolves settle when they have confirmed what they needed to confirm and are satisfied. All right, she said, as though this were simply new information she had filed away. You said there was a fire. I put her in the East Hall, which had not been used in some years but which had the largest hearth and the best light. A servant brought food. She ate with the appetite of someone who had been walking for several hours and did not see the point in pretending otherwise. I sat across from her at the long table that could have seated 40 and watched her, and tried to determine what was happening to me. The pull I had felt at the stones had not faded. If anything, it was stronger now, a low, steady warmth behind my ribs that had nothing to do with the fire. My wolf was quieter than he had been in decades, and I do not mean that in the sense of absence. I mean the quiet of a creature who has found what he was looking for and has finally, deeply, settled. 300 years of restlessness, stilled in the time it had taken her to step through a boundary stone and walk into my chest. I was trying to be reasonable about this. You're the Alpha King, she said. It was not a question. She had evidently been watching me watch her and had been assembling information at the same pace I had. Yes. And Aldenmere is a wolf kingdom. Yes. She considered this. My father's books mention a sealed wolf kingdom. He said it was a story. She picked up her cup. He's going to be very interested to learn he was wrong. How did you come through the stones? She set the cup down and looked at me directly. She had, I was noticing, an extremely direct gaze, the gaze of someone who has not yet learned to be careful with their attention around powerful people, or who has learned and decided it was not worth the effort. I don't know. I was following the deer trail and there was a circle of standing stones and there was a light, and I put my hand on the stone to steady myself on the ice, and then I was on the other side. She paused. The stone was warm. The boundary responds to, I stopped. She waited. The boundary responded to bloodline. The sealing rite required my own, the Alpha King's bond to the kingdom. The stones had never opened from the outside in 300 years, not for anything. They could not be forced, could not be coaxed, could not be opened by will or by strength. They opened for blood that was welcome. I did not say any of this. It responds to invitation, I said, which was close enough to the truth that I was not lying, and far enough from the whole of it that I could gather my thoughts. She accepted this without pressing it. She finished her food. She asked me, with genuine curiosity, whether the large wolves in the yard had always been partial to strangers, or whether that was particular to her. I told her it was particular to her. She considered this information with the same practical attention she had given to everything else, and then asked if the wolves would mind if she went back out to sit with them in the morning, because she found them calming. I said the wolves would not mind at all. She said good night and retired to the chamber the servant had prepared, and I sat alone at the long table in the East Hall with the fire burning down around me, and tried to understand what 300 years of waiting felt like when it was suddenly, undeniably over. I did not sleep. By the time the first gray light came through the high windows, I had been through every record I owned relating to the kingdom's history, the bonded Luna's bloodline, and the nature of the boundary stones. My court archivist, a careful and quietly alarmed man named Oswin who had served 3 of my council generations, arrived at the archive room at dawn to find me already there with the oldest of the bound volumes open before me. He looked at the volume, he looked at me. My lord, he said carefully, that is the bloodline ledger. I know what it is, Oswin. He was quiet for a moment. Then, very carefully, the young woman who arrived last evening. She came through the stones from the outside. Oswin said nothing. In 40 years of service, I had seen Oswin say nothing to mean several different things. This particular nothing meant that he was working very hard to remain calm about something that was not calm. The boundary opened for her, I said, from the other side. Without the sealing phrase, without a key token, without any of the things we have always believed necessary. I turned a page. The last time that happened was 312 years ago. When the bonded Luna came to Aldenmere, Oswin said. Yes. He came to stand beside me at the table. We both looked at the page before us, the Luna's bloodline entry, 3 centuries old, written in the careful hand of the archivist who had served my grandfather. The entry was long. It recorded her name, her lineage, the nature of her bond to the kingdom, and at the bottom, in smaller script, a note. The bloodline passes in the female line. The boundary will know it. Her family left Aldenmere, I said. After she died, her daughter was an infant. We recorded the departure. I found that entry too, a brief note, a date, a direction, north, toward the outer villages. And then nothing. 300 years of ordinary life outside the boundary, the bloodline carrying forward in the way bloodlines do, daughter to daughter through generations of people who would have had no reason to know what they were carrying. Until last night, Oswin said. Until last night. He was quiet again. Then gently, have you spoken with her this morning? She is in the yard with the wolves. There was a pause, all of them. The last I looked. Oswin folded his hands and looked at the middle distance in the way he did when he was ordering his thoughts. My lord, the bonding flame. I had been waiting for him to say it. In the east hall, in the alcove beside the hearth where it had stood for 300 years, a shallow iron bowl on a stone pedestal, built to hold the bonding fire that burned between an alpha king and his Luna. The flame was fed by the bond itself. It required no oil, no wick, no tending. It burned cold and steady for as long as the bond lived. It had been cold since my Luna died. Except that last night, when I had returned to the east hall after showing Marin to her chamber, I had found it lit. Not blazing, a small, steady flame the size of a candle burning in the bowl that had been dark for 3 centuries. I had stood and looked at it for a long time. I had not touched it. I was afraid, in the way a man who has stopped allowing himself to hope becomes afraid when hope returns, afraid to believe, afraid to look away, afraid that any movement would end it. When I had finally gone to the archive room, the flame was still burning. The bonding flame, I said to Oswin, lit last night. He put his hand on the back of a chair. I think it was to steady himself. Then she is. I don't know what she is. She is a woman who came through the stones by accident and asked if we had an inn. I closed the ledger. And she is currently in the yard with my wolves, and she does not know any of this, and I am not going to tell her while she is asleep on her feet from a long walk and finding her bearings in a world she did not know existed this morning. Oswin nodded slowly. What will you tell her? I picked up the ledger. The truth, I said, when she is rested and I have something true enough to say. She was in the yard. Not just with the wolves, with 14 wolves arranged around her in a loose half-circle, several of them lying down, and Marin herself seated on the stone mounting step with her ledger open on her knee, writing. She had a pencil behind her ear. She was describing the wolves, I realized, making notes about them with the same careful attention she had given to her herb pouches. Brennan was asleep with his head in her lap. I stood at the yard gate and watched this for a moment. The light was thin and cold, the kind of winter morning light that makes everything look as though it is being seen through old glass. The wolves were motionless. Marin's pencil moved steadily. She had not noticed me yet, and I had the peculiar experience of observing someone being entirely themselves, unperformed, unguarded, simply present, and finding that it answered something in me that I had not known was asking. She looked up. "Good morning." She looked at Brennan. "I hope this is all right." He seemed to want to, and I didn't have the heart to move him. "It is more than all right," I said. "Brennan has not done that with anyone in 40 years. She looked at Brennan with affection. "He seems like he's been waiting for a long time." The words landed somewhere in my chest, with a weight they had not been intended to carry. I crossed the yard and sat on the low wall opposite her, which put Brennan between us and 4 other wolves within arm's reach of each side. In 3 centuries of ruling Aldenmere, I had never sat on the yard wall. I was not certain what to do with my hands. I settled for resting them on my knees, which was what a man did when he was trying to appear composed and was not entirely succeeding. "I want to tell you some things," I said, "about why you came through the stones, about what the boundary is and what it means that it opened for you." She closed the ledger. She gave me her full attention, not guarded, not braced, simply attentive, ready to hear. "The boundary around Aldenmere is sealed by blood," I said. "The bloodline of the Alpha King and the bloodline of the bonded Luna. Those 2 bloodlines together are what close and hold the seal. Without them, the boundary fails gradually over decades until the kingdom is open to everything." I watched her face. 300 years ago, my bonded Luna died. Her family left Aldenmere. I have held the seal alone since then. She was very still. "The seal can open from the outside," I said, "only for a bloodline it recognizes. It has not opened from the outside once in 300 years, not once for anyone." I paused. "Until last evening." She looked at me. Her gaze was steady, but I could see her assembling the pieces of this, the same careful way she had assembled information about everything else since she arrived. She was not a person who reached for conclusions before she had enough of the shape. "The bonded Luna's bloodline," she said slowly. "You think I'm carrying it?" "I think the boundary does," I said. "It is not infallible, but in 300 years it has made no errors I have found." She was quiet. Brennan stirred in her lap and she put her hand on his head without looking down. The gesture was automatic, the reflex of someone who offers comfort without thinking about whether it is appropriate. It was, I thought, a very precise picture of her. "What does it mean?" she said. "Practically, if the boundary is right." "It means that the bloodline we believed lost 3 centuries ago is not lost." I chose my words carefully. "It means that the bond between the Alpha King and the bonded Luna of Aldenmere has a living thread to pull. It does not mean anything happens automatically. A bloodline is not a vow. A boundary opening is not a claim. You are not obligated to anything by virtue of stepping through a stone." She looked at me for a long time. "But," she said, and it was not a question. "But last night," I said, "the bonding flame in the East Hall lit for the first time in 300 years. She absorbed this. The bonding flame, what is that? A fire that burns between a bonded pair, fed by the bond itself, no oil, no wick. It burned while my Luna lived. It went cold when she died. It has been cold since. Until last night. Until last night." She looked at the wolves around her, at Brennan still and warm across her knees, at the younger wolves lying easy in the cold morning light, at the whole quiet circle of creatures who had come to her without being asked and settled without reservation. She looked back at me. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "When the stones opened last night," she said, "what did you feel?" I considered lying. Not dishonestly, considered saying something careful and measured, something that held the true thing at a distance while still technically answering. I had been doing that for 300 years in one way or another, holding the true things at a careful distance while still technically ruling a kingdom. "I felt," I said, "as though something I had forgotten I was carrying had set itself down." She looked at me for a moment that seemed to last longer than it was. Then she looked at Brennan and at the wolves, and at the thin, cold light above the yard walls. "All right," she said, quietly, not dismissively, the same word she had used last night when I told her about the fire, the word she seemed to use when she had taken in something large and was deciding to proceed with it rather than against it. "All right, what happens next?" What happened next was that Oswin arrived at midday with the bloodline ledger and a pot of tea, set both on the East Hall table, and opened the ledger to the entry for the bonded Luna. Marin read it. She read it carefully, the way she read everything from beginning to end, going back twice to the passage about the bloodline passing in the female line. She asked Oswin 3 questions about the record-keeping practices of 300 years ago, which Oswin answered with visible relief, as though someone asking practical archival questions was the most reassuring thing that had happened to him in some time. Then she sat back and looked at the entry for the bonded Luna's name, Elowen. "She was from outside the kingdom originally," Marin said. "It says here she arrived at the boundary by chance." "She did," Oswin said. "The records of her arrival describe it very similarly to—" He stopped. "To last night," Marin said. "Yes, my lady." She did not correct the "my lady." I noted this. She looked at me across the table. "Your records, does it say anything about what it was like for her, when she first understood what was happening?" Oswin glanced at me. I nodded. He turned several pages. He found the entry the archivist of 300 years ago had been thorough, the way archivists become thorough when they understand they are recording something that will matter. He read aloud. She said it was not like a thunderclap, the way the old stories described. She said it was like coming inside from a long walk in the cold. The warmth, she said, was not a surprise. It was a recognition. As though the warmth had always been there, and she had simply not been in the right room to feel it. The East Hall was very quiet. Marin looked at the bonding flame in its iron bowl beside the hearth. The small flame burned steady, the way it had been burning since the night before. "That is," she said carefully, "a fairly accurate description of what it has felt like since I stepped through the stones." I said nothing. I did not trust myself to say anything immediately, so I let the words sit and looked at the flame and waited. "I want to be clear about something," she said, and her voice was steady, plain-spoken, exactly herself. The voice she had used when she told me I was standing where she was trying to walk. "I'm not someone who does things because a ledger says she should, or because a boundary opened, or because a flame lit, or because a king needs something from me. I've been told all my life that I was too much trouble to be worth anything to anyone, and I decided a long time ago that the opinion of anyone who found me too much trouble was probably not worth keeping." I looked at her. "But," she said, and again it was not a question, "something happened when I stepped through those stones. And something happened last night when you described the bonding flame, and I sat with it through the night, and I am not someone who ignores what actually happened in favor of what would be more comfortable to believe." "No," I said, "I can see that." She looked at me steadily, the way she had looked at everything since she arrived, with attention, with honesty, without the performance of anything she was not actually feeling. "I don't know you." "And you don't know me. I find I would like to, though." She paused. "Know you if that's—" "Yes," I said, "it is." A corner of her mouth moved. It was a small thing, and quiet, and it did more to me than any gesture I could remember. "Good," she said. "Then tell me about the wolves." I told her about the wolves. I told her about Brennan, who was the oldest living descendant of the first wolf to choose a bonded pair in Aldenmuir's history, and who had spent 40 years choosing no one and tolerating everyone. I told her about the younger wolves, their names, their temperaments, the small politics of a wolf court that ran parallel to the human one, and was, in my private opinion, considerably better organized. I told her about the wolf meadow at the kingdom's center, where the pack ran free at night, and where on a clear winter night you could hear them from the archive rooms, and it was the loneliest and most beautiful sound I knew. She listened with the full attention she gave to everything. She asked questions, good questions, the kind that showed she had heard what I said and was building something from it, not just accumulating information. She asked how I knew which wolves chose which roles in the pack. She asked whether the older wolves ever chose the younger ones to carry their memories. She asked, with great seriousness, whether Brennan had a favorite sleeping position, and when I told her it was on his back with his paws in the air, she wrote this down in her ledger as though it were important herbalism. In return, she told me about her father's herb ledgers, which were the most comprehensive record of wild plants in the Northern Territories, and which her father believed were his life's most important work, and which Marin had been copying and organizing since she was 12 because someone had to. She told me about the deer trail she had been following before the stones, which she had been following because she had heard reports of a pale lichen that grew only in undisturbed forest floors and which was, she believed, more effective than anything currently in common use for treating joint pain in older wolves. She had been out looking for medicine for older wolves when she stepped through the boundary by accident. I thought about Brennan, asleep in her lap in the cold morning light. I thought about 300 years of a bloodline carrying forward without knowing what it carried, all the way to a woman with ink on her fingers and a ledger full of lichen notes, following a deer trail toward Aldenmere. "You were already coming," I said. She looked up from her ledger. "Before last night, you were already moving toward the boundary. You had been in whatever indirect way for some time. I did not say generations, though that was the truest version of it. It was not only an accident." She turned this over, the lichen. "Your father's ledgers, the knowledge that brought you out in winter, following that specific trail." She was quiet for a moment. "You're saying it was arranged." "I am saying that 300 years is a very long time, and that destinies, in my experience, do not tend to announce themselves. They tend to arrange ordinary things until the ordinary things become impossible to misread." She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, more like a settling, the same settling I had seen in Brennan when he was satisfied. That's a very dignified way of describing what happened, for a man who was nearly knocked down by a woman with a bag of herbs. I was not nearly knocked down. "You stepped back." I was surprised. She looked at her ledger. There was, I was nearly certain, the beginning of a smile at the corner of her mouth, though she was suppressing it with the focused attention of someone who has decided amusement is not the appropriate response to a situation and cannot quite make the amusement agree. I found that I liked her very much. My council met that evening. There were 7 of them, the heads of the 7 oldest families of Aldenmere, people who had been born in this kingdom, and whose parents had been born in it, and whose grandparents had watched my Luna die and the bonding flame go cold. They were not unkind people. They had simply been watching their king carry 300 years of waiting for so long that most of them had quietly stopped believing anything would change. I told them what the boundary stones had done, and what Oswin had found in the bloodline ledger, and what the bonding flame had done the night before. There was a long silence. Counselor Aldwin, who was the oldest of them and the one I respected most, folded her hands on the table and looked at the end of the room for a while. Then she said, "Is she well?" "The young woman." "She is. And she knows. I told her this morning. She took it carefully and honestly, as she seems to take everything." Aldwin looked at me. In 40 years of service, she had learned to read me in ways that I found occasionally uncomfortable and consistently useful. "And you, my lord?" I stopped. "I am trying to be measured about this, because she does not know me and I do not know her, and the bond is not a claim." Aldwin nodded slowly. "No, but the flame is burning." "The flame is burning." The council was quiet again. Then, unexpectedly, one of the younger counselors, Petra, who had been born the year after my Luna died, and who had grown up in a kingdom that had never known the bonding flame lit, said, very quietly, "What does it look like?" "The flame." "Small," I said, "steady, the size of a candle, it does not go out." Petra looked at the table. She did not say anything else, but I saw something in her face that I recognized, the expression of someone who has been told a thing is possible, intellectually, for their entire life, and is now being told it is true. I let the council ask their questions. I answered them honestly. I told them what I had told Marin, that the bloodline was not a vow, and that nothing had been decided, and that she was a guest in Aldenmere with the full freedom of the kingdom, and no obligation to anything beyond what she chose freely. The council accepted this with the patience of people who had learned to be patient over 3 centuries. Aldwin asked only one more thing before they departed. "Is she coming to the hall tomorrow?" "I believe so. She wants to check on the wolves." A quiet sound moved around the table that took me a moment to identify. It was, I realized, something very close to relief. The days that followed had a quality I had not felt in 300 years. Not urgency, not the sharp, particular urgency of a thing that has just arrived and must be navigated. Something quieter, the quality of a room that has been cold for a very long time and is slowly warming. Marin was in the yard in the mornings with the wolves. She was in the archive room in the afternoons, going through her father's ledgers and comparing them to Oswin's plant records with a focus that Oswin described to me, with visible admiration, as formidable. She ate with the council twice and asked them questions about the kingdom's history with the same direct attention she gave to everything, not performing interest, simply interested. She explored the candle-lit hallways of the archive levels with a candle in one hand and her ledger in the other, and returned from each expedition with 3 new questions, and a report on the state of the stonework that was more thorough than anything my maintenance staff had produced in years. She was not trying to fit into Aldenmere. She was simply present in it, in the way someone is present in a place they have already decided to understand. I walked with her in the evenings, which was not a thing I had planned. It became a thing that happened because she went to the Wolf Meadow at dusk to watch the pack run, and I went because the Wolf Meadow was in the same direction as the boundary stones which I checked each evening. And the first time we arrived at the same path at the same time, she said, "Oh, good. You know the way," and started walking, and I followed. And after that it was simply what we did. She talked to me about the herbs she was cataloging. I talked to her about the history of the boundary and the structure of the wolf pack, and the things I had noticed in 300 years of watching a sealed kingdom hold itself together through will and habit. She had opinions about everything: the organization of the archive, the wolves' hierarchy, the efficiency of the Eastern Gate's design, the likelihood that the pale lichen she had been seeking existed within the kingdom's borders, and she was going to find it if she had to look at every tree. Her opinions were direct, reasoned, and usually right. In the evenings the bonding flame burned steadily in the East Hall. On the 4th night, walking back from the meadow, she said, "Tell me about her, your Luna." I was quiet for a moment. "What would you like to know?" "Whatever you'd like to tell me." I thought about Aloan, who she had been, the 300 years of distance between that time and this one, the way grief becomes something else over long enough a span of time, not smaller but different, carried differently. She was kind, I said finally, genuinely kind in the way that is not strategic. She found every wounded thing in the kingdom and took it seriously. I paused. The wolves adored her. Of course they did, Marin said without irony. When she died, the bond flame went cold, and the wolves they were quieter than I had ever seen them, for a long time. I looked ahead at the torchlit walls of the kingdom. Brennan stopped eating for 2 weeks. Marin was quiet. Then he pressed his head into my hand the first moment he could. "Yes." Because he recognized. "I think so." She walked for a moment in silence. "I'm not her," she said, not defensively, simply as a statement of accurate fact. I know that. I mean, I would not want you to look at me and see someone else. I would want you to see who's actually here. I stopped walking. She went another step and then stopped and turned, and we stood in the cold, torchlit air with the wolf meadow behind us and the kingdom ahead. And I looked at her, at the ink on her fingers, and the ledger under her arm, and the direct, honest gaze that had been aimed at me with the same clarity since the moment she stepped through the boundary stones. "Marin," I said, "I see exactly who is here." Something in her face shifted, not the suppressed corner of the mouth amusement I had been watching for 4 days. Something quieter and less guarded. "Good," she said, after a moment. It was the same word she had used when I told her I would like to know her, the word she seemed to use when something was settled. We walked back to the kingdom, and the bonding flame was burning when we came in. On the 7th day, Oswin finished his comparison of the bloodline record and the boundary readings. He came to me in the archive room and laid 3 pages of notes on the table with the careful precision of a man who has done his work thoroughly and wants it to be received with the seriousness it deserves. He said, "The bloodline match is not circumstantial, my lord. The boundary's response to her presence has strengthened every day she has been within it. The seal is measurably more stable than it has been at any point in the past 3 centuries. The bonding flame's output has increased by, well." He pushed the top page forward. "The readings speak for themselves." I looked at the readings. The flame that had begun at the size of a candle on the first night was now burning at the level the records described for a fully active bond. "And she's been here a week," I said. "Yes." Oswin folded his hands. "My lord, I should also tell you, and I tell you this not to rush anything, but because you asked for my complete assessment, the boundary has, in the past 3 days, begun making room. In the old records, the archivist noted that in the weeks before the first Luna's bonding ceremony, the boundary itself shifted slightly, thickened at the edges, deepened at the center, as though it was settling into expectation. It is doing the same thing now." "Yes." I closed the notes. I sat with this for a moment, then I said, "Where is she?" "The yard, my lord, the morning wolves." She was where she always was. Brennan was awake this morning, sitting beside her rather than sleeping, and they were engaged in what appeared to be a one-sided conversation in which she described the lichen notes she had made the day before, and Brennan listened with the focused attention of a wolf who has excellent priorities. I sat on the wall. She looked over at me and then looked back at her ledger. She finished the point she was making to Brennan. I found, over 7 days, that I had entirely accepted that she talked to the wolves as a natural and reasonable practice. And then she closed the ledger and turned to face me. "You have that face," she said. "What face?" "The one you get when you've been looking at something in the archive, and it has told you something you are now deciding how to tell me." I looked at her. I had been told by 4 different people over 3 centuries that I was difficult to read. Marin had apparently taken about 3 days to render that assessment obsolete. "Oswin finished the bloodline comparison," I said. "And?" I told her. All of it, the boundary strengthening, the flames increase, the boundary making room. I told her in the same plain terms she had always given me, because she was a person who received plain terms better than carefully managed ones, and I had learned in 7 days to give her what she could actually use. When I had finished, she was quiet for a while. Brennan leaned against her side. She put her hand on his back without looking down. "The boundary is doing what boundaries do," she said, "when what they have been waiting for arrives." "Yes." She looked at the sky above the yard walls. A thin winter sun was making its way through the gray. "I found the pale lichen," she said, "yesterday afternoon. It grows on the north side of the old stone arch at the boundary's edge." I looked at her. "It's exactly where it should be," she said, and there was something in her voice that I thought might have been the sound of a person who has been practical all her life, making room, carefully and without fanfare, for something that was not practical, that was not in any ledger that she had simply looked at long enough to believe. The boundary, the bloodline, the wolves choosing me. She met my eyes. I was already coming, you said, before last night, before the stones. I believe so. Then I think, she said, that it might be time to stop describing this as an accident. I was quiet for a moment. What would you call it? She looked at me for a long time, the direct, honest, unguarded gaze that I had found at the center of every moment of the past 7 days. I would call it arriving, she said, finally to the right place. The winter sun came through the yard. The wolves were still around us. Brennan leaned heavier against her side, and she leaned slightly into me. The bonding ceremony of Aldenmere, by old custom, required only 2 things: the bonded pair before the flame and the court present to witness. I had not planned to hold it on the 8th day. I had planned, in the careful, measured way I had learned to plan things over 300 years, to wait, to give her more time, to not let 3 centuries of waiting make me into someone who rushed a woman who was still finding her way in a world she had not known existed 2 weeks ago. Marin made this plan obsolete. She came to the archive room on the morning of the 8th day, sat across from me at the table and said, "I want to ask you something. You can say no." I waited. "The bonding ceremony," she said. "What does it require of me?" "To stand before the flame," I said, "and to choose freely." She looked at me. "That's all." "That is all." She considered this. "And the flame will do what exactly?" "If the bond is true, it blazes, fully, in front of the court." I held her gaze. "It is a public thing. The court sees the bond confirmed." "Good," she said. "I'd like that. I'd like people to see clearly what is actually happening, rather than speculating about it." She looked at her hands. "I've spent a long time with people speculating about me in ways I couldn't do anything about. This seems like the preferable version." She looked back at me. "When?" I looked at her, at the ink on her fingers, at the ledger she had carried into the archive room out of habit, even though she had not opened it, at the directness of her gaze and the plainness of her words, and the way she had arrived in my kingdom like a key that had finally found the right room. "Tonight," I said, "if you are ready." "I've been ready since the 2nd day," she said. "I was waiting for you to stop being measured about it." The East Hall held 40. That evening it held 41. The 7 council members, their families, Oswin and his assistant, the stable hands and the kitchen staff and the archive clerks, every member of the household who could be gathered. And the 14 wolves, who came in from the yard without being invited and arranged themselves along the walls with the particular dignity of creatures who know when they are witnessing something important. Marin stood in the center of the hall in the same traveling dress she had arrived in, because when Petra had offered her something from the court stores, she had said she would rather wear something that was hers, and I had been glad, because she was most fully herself in it. I stood across from her. The bonding flame was in its iron bowl between us, burning at full height now, a steady warm gold that made the candle-lit hall brighter than it had been since Eloin's time. The hall was very quiet. "Marin," I said, her name and nothing else for a moment. I had prepared things to say, careful, considered, the words a king uses when he is bonding before his court. I looked at her, and the prepared words were not what came. "You arrived here by accident. You nearly knocked me down. You asked if we had an inn, and you talked to the wolves before you asked where you were. You have reorganized the North Archive in a week and a half, and Oswin is not upset about it. You found the lichen." I stopped. "And I have not been this certain of anything in 300 years. She looked at me. Her gaze was steady and warm and direct and entirely, completely her. "I don't do things because a ledger says I should," she said, which was what she had said on the first morning, in the same tone, the same words, but now they landed differently, the ending changed. "I do them because I have looked at them long enough to be sure. I have looked at this long enough." she paused. I choose this freely, because it is right. And then because she was Marin and could not help being plainly, entirely herself. Also because Brennan will be devastated if I leave. The quiet in the hall broke. It was not laughter exactly. It was something warmer than that, a collective exhale, the sound of a room full of people letting go of 300 years of held breath. I held out my hand. She took it, in the way she had taken everything since she arrived, without ceremony, without hesitation, with the plain, honest grip of someone who has decided to proceed. The bonding flame blazed. Not gold now, white, the same white the boundary stones had shone when she stepped through, filling the hall from floor to beam with a light that was not cold at all, that was warm as a summer morning, that reached every corner of a room that had been without it for 3 centuries, and did not seem to have forgotten what it felt like. The 14 wolves along the walls lifted their heads. Brennan, sitting beside Petra at the edge of the court, let out a sound that was not quite a howl, something softer and older, a sound I had not heard in 300 years but knew immediately, the way you know a word in a language you were not sure you still remembered. It meant home. Aldwyn had her hand over her mouth. Petra was not bothering to hide the tears. Oswin stood perfectly straight and utterly still in the way of a man who will not let himself be undone in public, but whose carefully maintained composure was barely holding. I held Marin's hand in mine, and the flame burned steady between us, and the hall was warm in a way it had not been for longer than anyone present could remember. Later, when the court had gone to their own fires and the wolves had returned to the meadow to run, we sat in the east hall with the bonding flame between us and the remains of the evening on the long table, and Marin had her ledger open and was making notes. "What are you writing?" I said. "Observations," she said. "About?" She looked up. The flame's light made her face warm and clear. "About the bonding flame, the way it behaved before and after, the color difference, it was gold and then it was white, and I want to understand whether that's consistent across all bonding ceremonies or specific to the bloodline situation or—" "Marin." She looked at me. "You were just bonded before 40 people and a hall full of wolves." "I know. You're taking notes." She looked at her ledger, then at me, then at the flame. "I find note-taking clarifying," she said, and then more quietly, "and it's either this or sit here and feel everything very loudly, and I prefer to do that in private." I looked at her. "It's a great deal," she said simply. "In the best way I just need." "Time," I said. "A few minutes." She looked at the flame. "It's very beautiful, the flame." "It is." We sat in the quiet of the hall. The flame burned steady. Outside, somewhere in the wolf meadow, I could hear the pack running, the soft, low sound of it, the sound that had been the only company I kept for 300 years on winter nights. It sounded different now. Not lonelier, fuller. Marin closed her ledger. She looked at me across the table, in the warm light, with ink on her fingers and the plain direct gaze that I had been given, freely and without reservation, every day since she stepped through the boundary stones and nearly knocked me down. "All right," she said, "I'm done taking notes." "Good." She reached across the table. I reached back, her hand in mine, across the old wood, with the bonding flame burning between us and the winter fires of Aldenmere coming on below, and outside, the wolves running and the boundary holding, and the whole long waiting finally, quietly over.